David, welcome to Michigan.
Thanks a lot, Don. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have to make a few minor corrections to that. I don't know how you got all that on one screen, but especially the classic car part, which now consists mostly of an old tractor, and but the woodsman part is definitely true. I tend to be a recluse whenever I possibly can. I especially want to thank everybody for showing up today. I was back in Bali 5 weeks ago working with a linguist friend of mine actually on a medical anthropology project, and Obama showed up the day I arrived there too. So I don't know what's going on, but something weird's happening. This is a really great opportunity for me. I'm really delighted to be here, and I realize that putting Obama aside, there are some really distinguished people in the audience, which makes me somewhat embarrassed to be talking about their territory in ways that they could better do so. But what I want to do today is that my talk is really about what it's like to be someone who works sometimes in theoretical anthropology and sometimes very concretely in applied anthropology. Don alluded to my role as directing a Center for Global Citizenship, which essentially has to do with mentor-apprentice learning, getting graduate students involved with NGOs to do applied work, allowing them to see what it's like to have a conflict of interest, to have to work under a gag rule. I mean, all the sorts of things that happen in the real world when you decide you want to actually do something. And along the way, I've done a fair amount of consulting work. My other area of interest is on vulnerable populations generally. I've worked with the homeless, and because I'd done work on human trafficking from Eastern Europe into the UK, Albania specifically, and also worked in another related project in Romania, I was asked by Merlin UK if I would get involved with the project that they were working up in Myanmar after Cyclone Nargis in May 2nd, 2008. And a friend of mine was very much involved in that, so I had kind of a lead in and felt that I had somebody I could talk to about being a completely naive, non-native speaker working around a subject that was important to me, but in a place that I knew virtually nothing about outside of the minimal reading that I had done as an outsider, and the fact that I had followed Aung Suu, who is an old friend of mine from my Oxford days, and her husband, late husband, Michael Aris, who was a dear friend of mine. But I had no concrete knowledge. I was not in any sense an expert, although I had a fair amount of familiarity with the question of how you assess vulnerability. And what I want to talk about today is what happened to me in that experience and what I learned from it, some of the things that we were able to accomplish and some of the things that we couldn't. And if you'll forgive me, what I'm going to do is I want to start out this talk by using an article that appeared in our professional newsletter in October 2008 by Ingrid Jord, who's at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who is very deeply involved in Myanmar. And the article basically is about her frustration with having to do things like set up a blog that would provide information for people who could log on to that, feeling very much as if her hands were tied in terms of what actually she could do within the context of what was happening then. And of course, things have opened up considerably in various ways today. But what I want to do is go back to that to kind of construct for you the way my discipline responded. So I'm interested in this both critically examining how this was represented in a limited way in my field, and I also want to use that then as a backdrop to talk about where I fell into this and the various things that happened as a result of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to proceed by essentially by reading, at least for the first 15 minutes or 20 minutes, some snippets from paragraphs from her article in the wake of Cyclone Nargis, and then I'll show some things that happened. I mean, this is boilerplate for people who know this, so forgive me for the superficiality of the slide. But I want to set this within the context of how it was represented, is what I'm saying. because I think far too easily it's for us to think about the present and say, well, things aren't like that, and all that's changed, and that's yesterday, not today. But if you think about what the circumstances were, it helps you get a better sense of what was going on, why people made the decisions that they made. Okay. Cyclone Nargis hit the Irrawaddy Delta region in Burma, also known as Myanmar, on May 2nd of this year. The cyclone directly caused an estimated 137,000 deaths and left 2.4 million survivors in need of food, water, and shelter. Political, logistical, and conceptual obstructions to information gathering and reporting from the affected region have contributed to the magnitude of the disaster. Because, and I'm skipping down here a very little bit, because of the loss of draft animals in the storm and an insufficiency of seeds and fertilizer, the November yield is expected to be disappointing. The fishing industry, the second leading source of food and income in the Delta, was also hobbled by the storm as fishing boats and gear were lost in the 12-foot sea swell that inundated fields and buried entire villages under sand, and I will add, in the middle of the night. A tripartite assessment led by the government of the Union of Myanmar, the United Nations, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, anticipates the food aid will need to continue until the second monsoon crop arrives in April and May 2009, some of which, of course, was salinated and useless. Political obstacles, she goes on, are that the junta has seized power in 1962, has held it in a succession of repressive military rulerships. The current authoritarian military regime, which calls itself the State Peace and Development Council, SPDC, has restricted free speech, and lately free movement within the country are outlawed. From the outset, SPDC responded to the disaster as a security issue in need of control rather than a humanitarian disaster in need of relief. A very, obviously, extremely relevant and important point. The area was locked down. Those attempted to photograph or by other media report on the events were arrested. The military blocked the entry of aid workers and goods into the country, prompting an international rebuke of the regime for its obstructionist posture and anti-democratic politics. France's Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner invoked the UN's, quote, responsibility to protect in order to reach the cyclone victims without junta approval. This antagonistic posture undermined Western governments' protestations that their intentions were strictly humanitarian. Inside the country, the poor infrastructure for administering and distributing aid, particularly the more remote regions affected, impeded any effort by foreigners or the SPDC to help Nargis victims. The disaster was left to free fall. Relief goods that did enter the country were stored in warehouses for distribution by military personnel who used them to help their own families in natal villages. In mid-May, General Dan Shui was televised making public donations at a mock refugee camp filled with actor refugees. This pageantry would be repeated daily, with other ministers and generals paraded out for the state-run television over the following weeks. Meanwhile, Nargis victims languished. Okay. What I want to do now is to tell you a little bit about what happened with respect to my participation. Those of you who know this area know that it's the Delta region is an area of 20,000, roughly 19,500 square miles. The death tolls were guesstimates at best. The problems with migration were guesstimates at best. The question of how many children entered into military subscription as a result of losing family, how many women end up in trafficking, these were estimated figures at best. And the situation was complex, to say the least. In June, late June, I was contacted to see if I would be interested in participating after the events that are described here in the discussions that were taking place between this tripartite core group of ASEAN, the government of Myanmar, and the United Nations, to see if I could actually assist in developing a vulnerability assessment tool that could be appended to a large household survey that was going to be conducted under their aegis. And I went out to Myanmar and was put on a helicopter and taken on one of those $50,000 UN flights to have a look at the area of devastation. And what you see here are images from that helicopter flight. And what you see is, as you can see, virtually nothing in terms of human survival in the very southwestern areas from Labuda south to the coastal regions. You can see remnants of what used to be roads and buildings, but virtually almost no human habitation, at least in many of the areas that we flew over. And even at this late stage, this picture is taken at this time, you can see that there's a massive amount of flooding that inhibited the ability of relief to get to many parts of the country. And on this helicopter flight, when we came back, I asked the pilot, because we put down twice, once in Labuda and once at the very coast at the refugee camp, and I asked him where else we might stop, and he said nowhere. These were the two places where they had pads that they felt safely they could land the helicopter. And this is obviously a good bit of time afterwards. The devastation was so unbelievably incredible that I thought I'd begin by at least sharing some of these slides with you. What you see here is on our way back. I poked my head through the window and took a picture of a traditional family compound, and you can see here the traditional freshwater resource and relatively, apparently, although not, they weren't, in fact, what might have been otherwise prosperous rice fields. And here you see a similar photograph taken in a place where flooding had actually salinated the fresh water. To give you a sense of what the migration problems were, and actually the difficulty not only of assessment but also of trying to come to terms with what actually could be done, putting aside the whole political difficulties that were having to be dealt with. So what I'd like to do for a moment, if you don't mind, then, is to say a few words about where we flew at to the end of the Delta, and this is one of the premier government refugee camps, and you can see the freshwater source, that hexagon to the right, and you can see the ocean beyond. I'd like to just show you a few slides here. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice immediately is the proximity to the ocean and the absence of boats. All of the hardwood, because we're fundamentally using UNICEF and WHO and UN notions of how refugees might best be cared for. But it created a lot of problems here because the wood went into the buildings rather than into the boats, and the food source is right there, but there's no way of getting at it. And so fundamentally, people became quite dependent upon what was given to them. And you'll remember that already once we're in a post-disaster period, the rice portions are cut in half. The problems of food shortage and what people actually do becomes quite real for them. Here you see one lonely boat making its way along the coast. And here you see the camp itself, the monastery in the background, the temple in the background being rebuilt, that is to say, to establish some notion of community. And you'll notice that this sort of military idea of how you construct a refugee camp, although obviously people appreciated the shelter, presented incredible problems for people in terms of decision making with respect to what they would actually do to get by and what choices they should make. Here you can see that very nicely the way all of the outhouses are separated from the dwellings However, you notice there's one big problem. Who can see? Any water people here? Yes, they're sitting in the water. Okay, so because the water table is so high, the idea of having an outhouse where you actually control the flow of sewage is made impossible. So they might as well have just put seats out in the, in a cloth, because although people were trying their best, and I'm not criticizing the effort here, I'm just trying to describe from the standpoint of insiders some of the problems that obtain. Here you can see that a little bit better, the pathway between the dwelling and the outhouse. You also notice that this is looking on the street side of the dwelling, that the question of privacy is really quite compromised. Now you say, well, why complain? At least people have a roof over their heads, which is quite true. And again, I'm not criticizing the efforts. I'm just pointing out to the problems that obtain for people who live in these conditions, which is to say it becomes very difficult for people to convey information in any confidential form. And this is something that I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about when I discuss the intervention. Furthermore, because the dwellings were not securable, when people's rice allotments were cut in half, the question of whether you stay at home and protect your rice from thieves and go out and look for something to do, or that decision for people was a very hard one, and one that, for the most part, did not encourage people to engage in rebuilding activities on their own, because there was no way of securing their food source. Okay. Here you see, obviously, a map of the region. Here's Lopute here, and we were down in this right here at the end. And I wanted to show this because this is from the report that we published with the UN in December of that year, which is available. It's available online. And what this actually is a map showing the percentage of people who received medical treatment or had access to a medical figure, either from the government or an NGO, by November of 2008. Remember, this happened in May 2nd, 2008. And the high, of course, is in this region, which was the worst hit region. But this was also very badly hit. I mean, I'll show you another. You'll see later on the course of the cyclone. But the high is only 68%. Something over half of the people in those regions actually had access or had any medical attention, and the lows are obviously zeros. You can see that I'm trying to paint a picture here of the fact that even many months after the event, when many of the NGOs had gone elsewhere, that there was still a massively unmet need. Massively unmet need. It was way off the radar of the international media by this point, but the actual facts of relating to medical attention were really quite astonishing and startling. And within the centers, you'll see this woman in another picture when I talk about the intervention. Within the camps themselves, the problem of privacy meant that a lot of the traditional ways in which one looks at vulnerability, say in Kosovo or a place like that, where you ask, well, how many women were raped by the military? You couldn't ask those questions for not just for political reasons, but because you would be endangering the people that you were talking to, and ethically, there was no follow-up counseling for anyone. So the idea of asking randomly painful questions to people without any other kind of an intervention made it ethically complicated. When that information was offered, it was taken quietly by interviewers, but it was not something that could be sought out. And I want to emphasize this because this was one of the places where we had a difficult time, because many of the NGOs that work with women in child protection want to know these these statistics. They want that information in household surveys, and they want to be able to publicize it. It's good. It's good and well intentioned, but it does make it very, very difficult actually to get anything accomplished. And what I want to do is to talk about now about the process of how we tried to actually allow ourselves to do some field work and gather some information. So let me just get back to Ingrid's article. I want to read a little bit more. There's not a lot. I won't bore you with all of it, but I just want to give you again a flavor again of how this was represented. The successes of Doctors Without Borders and organizations like Merlin UK, for which I worked, and select other groups, unfortunately reveals the faults of the UN World Food Program and the majority of INGOs. Until a full assessment of the event is available, how I wouldn't know, it would be imprudent to drop a list of their alleged errors. However, it can be stated with certainty that INGOs and the UN did not use the majority the UN did not use in the majority of cases what anthropologists call quote-unquote local knowledge. How can anthropologists, she then goes on to ask in our journal, contribute to the prevention of famine and other calamities associated with policy failures in confronting natural disasters? We have two advantages, she concludes, that foreign governments and aid organizations do not have. First, we specialize in local knowledge. In the case of Burma, for instance, most anthropologists of mainland Southeast Asia would be aware of the role that Buddhist institutions, as expansive ready-made donation and distribution networks, might play in a relief effort. The second advantage anthropologists hold is access. Most of us work as individuals, and therefore we raise few red flags when we wander into remote or politically sensitive regions. Now, that may be a generalization in most cases. In Burma, obviously, one would contest that adamantly. Even in running our trials out of Yangon, out of Rangoon, we, which meant a 6-hour drive to the first really hard-hit areas, we went through at least 4 roadblocks, all of which we had to present documentation that we were entitled to be doing what we were doing. So the idea of actually, at that time at least, in this region, of going, as it were, undercover. Now, that raises a whole sorts of other issues about what you do once you find something out and how you actually deal with it. We weren't going to do that at all. As far as I was concerned, the only progress we would possibly make was with proper, thank you very much, was being able to negotiate in an open way with the government, finding out what we actually could do, and then trying to build a protocol after that. So, in September of 2008, we held a number of meetings with various representatives from NGOs who were concerned about basically the Women and Child Protection Group, the government of Myanmar, the UN, and obviously members, representatives of particularly Thailand, who were in a position to make more of an impact because of trade relations than almost anyone there, and for whom we probably owe our ability to be able to have conducted the work that we did, because they were the ones who were able to suggest that this was probably in the junta's best interest to allow this to happen. And then the question was, how would we do the household survey? And that's what I want to talk about here. I was at first at this stage asked, as I mentioned at the beginning, to introduce 20-some questions to a large-scale household survey, which I'll talk about in a second. And actually, let me talk about that now, because it'll give you a better idea of the background against which this work was carried out. The household survey was an in-depth examination of both quantitative and empirical data about living conditions, and it took some very specific our measurements for malnutrition, for instance, looked at conditions of living, looked at head members of household, and it collected quite a bit of data. All in all, there were 2,376 households that were interviewed in 108 communities, a total of about, exactly 4,862 children were also involved in this, and altogether roughly 13,500 people were questioned, and that information gathered from them. And the way this was done is the way most of these statistical surveys are carried out. It's rather like doing plotting growth of trees on my cabin land in upstate New York. I mean, you use hexagons rather than rectangles or squares because you can, because geometrically you can get to a central point. You can actually identify, if you're randomly selecting sites to visit, you can do it much more successfully. You can't have circles, clearly. It's like the atomic bomb, which is built around, this hex-pent configuration. If you want to make something round, geometrically, these are the figures you use. What you see here are the 113 hexagons, and 108 of which actually are on land and provide places to survey. And there is the path of the cyclone in red passing along that. One of the things that became apparent right away was that of the people who would be surveyed, roughly only about 10% of them lived in what UN would consider an adequate, under the circumstances, adequate housing. So the household survey was an extremely important part of this endeavor. And typically, when we do quantitative and qualitative work, you look at the survey, you try to find out what is going on in it, and then you go back to the location with field workers, and you try to ask cogent questions around that to see how robust the survey actually is. When you have more time, what you do is you link the qualitative work to the quantitative work specifically, and you use what's called a plug-in method, where the things that can be brought out of the quantitative work actually give you information about the qualitative work, and then you go out and look at that very carefully. And for example, I did a survey of rural primary care recruitment and retention in the United States, and we did very much like this, but it took us about 6 years to do the whole project. That wasn't the possibility here, and so instead we sat down and I asked the quantitative team if they could possibly code the surveys as they were coming in for some of the standard indicators of vulnerability. And this is what we ended up doing, was designing, coding the quantitative survey, and actually having a filter. You see on the left there's household questionnaire, there's the data entry and verification cleaned data sets. And then on the right, this is the part I want to draw your attention to. First, the unverified first day data for entry for data for day. What this meant was that because we could take these measures of vulnerability and put them into the data sets in the computer, we were able, within 24 hours of starting this, to kick out households to go to actually ask more specific questions. So rather than waiting for a year for the whole survey to be analyzed and conclusions to be drawn and then figure out what the next phase was, we couldn't tell you how many households fit a particular category, but we knew we had a household that did. And we waited to find out. 3 months down, we had better data. 6 months down, we had better data. So eventually, we would be able to get to that. But we were able. We couldn't tell you whether any of these categories that you see on the left, what the percentage was. But since these were the vulnerability categories, they allowed us to do the interviewing quite quickly. As you see, their household with malnourished child. These are all standard international criteria of vulnerability. Household with school-age children not attending school. Household with reduced, compared to before Nargis, utilization of land. A household with children living in substandard accommodation. Female-headed households with young children. Households in which the main carer is male. Households in which the main carer is less than 18 years old. Households in which the main caregiver is a grandparent. Households that consist of members of different pre-Nargis households. Households with an adolescent girl who is unrelated to the head of household. These are all recognized categories of vulnerability. And so the work that we did, to a certain extent then, also for us, functioned as a verification instrument. So just to summarize this, what I'd asked the committee was whether we could change the nature of the intervention rather than simply adding questions to the household survey. And then if they would allow me, through with permission of the government, to actually train a team of people who could go out and carry out the qualitative research as a kind of a reconnaissance activity. We weren't in a situation here where we could train people for a month or 2 months. We literally had to do this in 3 days. So the question became how we got to the INGOs, to the local, CBOs, the community-based organizations, where we could identify potential field workers who had an interest in doing this, recruit them, review what we were trying to accomplish, and then get them out into the field as quickly as possible. I won't spend a lot of time on the nature of the qualitative survey, but I do want to talk about it as a plug-in approach, because this kind of approach had never been used in a disaster or post-disaster relief context because of obviously the logistical and organizational requirements of doing something this are significant. And more challenging was the fact that it had never been used as a rapid assessment tool at all. But those of you the country know that there were a lot of very intelligent, bright, motivated people who showed up who had a deep interest in seeing this work. So we had lots of friends in court to move this along. And the question was identifying a group of 18 of them and then reviewing our questionnaire, which had to be very short. And the reason for that I'll explain now. Essentially, what we tried to do was to address some of the issues that were raised by Ingrid's article, and then also to present those in such a way so that the government would find it acceptable. And I was going to read you the statement that we drew up that was circulated. The Minister of Agriculture sat on this committee for a while, and so we had access to actually finding out how various political people higher up would respond to this intervention. We had to do it in a way that was very bland and understated, and we did not encourage people to say things that would endanger them. And if they did, the field workers were instructed to try to do whatever they could to assure the privacy and safety of those people if they decided to do that. So the last thing we wanted to do was to get any of the people who were doing the field work in jail either. I won't read that statement because I've been asked to stop by 1:45 or 10 to at the earliest, so we have time for discussion. But because I want to review this a little bit with you to tell you some of the problems that I experienced and what we actually tried to accomplish. The first survey is divided into 3 parts. The first is formal, and what we mean by formal is we're trying to get a sense of what people actually knew about NGOs and who had been there, because a lot of people see someone in a uniform and they assume they're government, whether they're UN or whatever it happens to be. So the first domain of inquiry within which this qualitative vulnerability assessment instrument examined, we call them formal kinds of post-disaster assistance. And formal meaning nature, I won't read these to you, it'll take too long, but the idea is nature of assistance received, which government agency, UN agency, international NGO, local NGO, CBO. The period, when, duration of effect, temporary, long-term, type, kind of assistance provided, needs met, needs not met, equality of access. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. None of this is very complex, actually, but I want to show you why we did it and what we tried to achieve out of it. The second level are the community assistance level, and this examines indigenous community structures, the very thing that Ingrid said that wasn't being looked at, modes of cooperation, resilience, and mutability. So community C here, domains of inquiry include and again, I won't read them, but nature of community cooperation, presence or absence, customary rules, do they exist, what are they, do people comply by them, duration of effect, temporary, long-term, are there new forms that emerge, equality of access, sustainability, will they grow or continue, how can we promote that sustainability? So we then became anthropologists really rather quickly and tried to identify whether or not there were any institutions that were surviving and actually could be used as models that were actually working very, very well. And then the third part of this, and perhaps in some ways, because this part would have to do with things like capacity building, which unfortunately this intervention had nothing to do with and failed to want to show an interest in supporting, because that's another call. I am a little cynical here because I think there's so much that could be done on the back of the work that was carried out by the very people that worked with us. The third was the vulnerability domain, which examines perceptions of vulnerability. And here we're including things like identifying the vulnerable, who suffered most, nature of vulnerability, kind of vulnerability, coping patterns altered, is this normal or calamity suffering, normal or calamity coping. And finally, and probably most important, was we asked our field workers to ask the people they interviewed. Remember, we're getting the people they interviewed initially out of the household survey. Are there people more vulnerable than you? So are we getting to the right people here? And we learned some really, I don't have time to talk about it in detail, we learned some really interesting things here. And one of them was that the most vulnerable group of all wasn't even in the equation. And the most vulnerable group were young women who reached puberty upon going to the monastery to ask for rice, because they were turned around and put back on the street. Okay? So, and this was a category that wouldn't come up in any international venue, but it came from obviously the very place where the resources, what limited resources they were, which were the monasteries, which did the best they could under the circumstances, but also had rules about women and men together in a particular situation of proximity. So I won't say much more about that at this point, but I think that one of the things that I learned from this was that, first of all, that the level of suffering that took place was almost unimaginable, and secondly, that under the right circumstances of cooperation, and here even from places that we didn't think we'd get cooperation, that we were able to, at least to start to make a little dent on answering some of the questions about who was vulnerable and why they were vulnerable. Altogether, we collected 356 stories, and I'm negotiating to try to see if I can publish some of those. That's also problematic, as you might guess. But what I'd like to do in the context of this talk is I'll just end by reading you a couple of these, and you'll forgive my horrific pronunciation. U Khin Mo was a dynamic and entrepreneurial community leader in a thriving agricultural community in the Myanmar Delta. He owned a large wooden house with a galvanized sheet metal roof in which he housed his wife and 3 of his 7 sons. 10 years ago, he was a day worker who owned no land, but due to his hard work and management skills, he slowly purchased one paddy field after another. Hence, he now owns 40 acres of paddy field. Before the Nargis cyclone, his business flourished, and everyone in the village respected him. Because of this respect, the villagers asked him to take up the chairmanship of the committee for providing electricity to the village. Due to his efforts, the village was able to set up electrical cables and poles in no time. In order to get electricity to the village, those who owned farmland donated significant amounts of money. Because the villagers were quite eager to get electricity to the village, some even borrowed money with interest to pay their share of the contribution. It was only a matter of days, 10 days to be precise, before electricity would finally be brought to the village when Cyclone Nargis struck Myanmar. It destroyed everything along its path, including the electric poles and cables. It also destroyed much of his farmlands. He shared his experience of the night with Nargis when Nargis struck the village. Since his house was big and strong, he was not initially worried. This is the voice of the interviewer, clearly. But as the night grew darker and darker, the water initially rose some 3 feet. At that time, a nearby house was about to collapse, and the family of 5 who lived there came rushing into his house, pleading for shelter from the storm. They waited through the night for the winds to calm down and the water level to subside. The next day, he saw that many of the houses in the village had collapsed. Additionally, there were fallen electric poles and cables everywhere. His heart was broken. Moreover, he became truly worried about what others in the community might think of him, or what those who had borrowed money to sponsor the electric project would say to him. for he now knew that they would have to eat less to pay interest on money borrowed for an expensive and now failed enterprise. When he saw also that the paddy fields were destroyed, it was too much for him to bear. He could neither eat nor sleep. Soon he was found walking in the village during the night, making nonsensical speeches, or simply talking gibberish to himself. When the villagers saw this, they worried about the fate of their once kind-hearted community leader. Though he is now attempting to recover from his destitute sense of failure, the depths of the failed project remain as a significant burden to several villagers, as well as a strong reminder of what can happen when stormwaters ruin the best intentions of citizens. And of course, now, because people can't pay their loans, if you want one, you're either going to spend 60% interest. At that time, loans were being given out privately at 60% interest, or a plywood and tarpaulin shack for a year's labor. That was the exchange. U Hya So is a 60-year-old head of household who shares with his wife. He shares with his wife and one granddaughter. I'll read two more brief ones. He and his wife are farmers. Their family is poor. 6 months before Nargis Myanmar calendar year, his house and two other neighboring houses were collapsed by tornado. That tornado was so strong that his cart and agricultural equipment was tossed through the air. His granddaughter, who was playing at the neighbor's house when the tornado struck, was also taken into the air for some time and then dropped in a distant field on the banks of a canal. Her face was badly smashed. Though she now is scarred, she luckily survived. Then came the day of Nargis. Her parents had taken her and her 3 siblings to the sea to find firewood. When the storm struck, her parents put all the children in a container and set them adrift in the hope that they might escape the disaster. Her brother and 2 sisters died at sea, but luckily, although her head was again injured, she was rescued while adrift by a local group searching for survivors. However, now, because of her head trauma, she is unable to pursue school, like other children, being removed from the 1st grade and placed in a school's kindergarten. Whenever the sky becomes dark blue and heavy rain clouds, she looks vacantly and dejected. Sometimes she pleads for the return of her parents. Her mental suffering needs to be treated. Dam Yin Tien is a widow as well as head of household, in which she cared for 2 sons and 1 daughter. During the night when the Nargis cyclone came, a strong gust of wind nearly collapsed the house, as she and her children sat huddling together on a mat inside. They ran for their lives, their eldest son leading the way. While he was running, a wind blew down an electric pole which fell on him. He died on the spot. When this tragic event occurred, she was following the elder son with her 2 younger daughters. When she saw her son lying on the road under the electric pole, she shouted out for help. However, due to the strong winds, no one heard her cries. She tried to lift the electric pole on her own, but failed to move the heavy weight. When she touched her son's body, she realized that he was already dead. As she sat there crying with her 2 remaining children, the water rose quickly on the road, and she had to run to the house on the other side of the road, where she and the surviving children hid from the storm. The water continued to rise and flooded the entire village. The next day, when the winds calmed, she asked for community assistance to bury her son's dead body. After Nargis, she was forced to live in a very small hut, having also lost her money and belongings. Unlike before the storm, she is now unable to sell vegetables, and her now eldest son has had to drop out of the 6th grade to take a low-paying job herding a neighbor's ducks. For this, he receives about equivalent of about 70 cents, U.S. cents, on which the entire family must survive. So I could go on and read several of these, but what, first of all, I want to point out is obviously the immense diversity of them. The fact that we were able at least to quantify some of these as they relate to things like post-traumatic stress, food, shelter, malnutrition, these standard measures, and actually then find these people and go out and spend some time with them, and to be able to tie these stories to the quantitative data so we could not be accused of sensationalizing, picking the most disastrous story to make a sensational statement to the press. It also allowed us eventually to come up with some recommendations, which are in this report about more effective ways of distributing resources. And then the part that is still unsatisfied, in my view, is the question of how we can use this to generate an in-country team for future capacity building, and also helping people in other countries who are suffering from similar problems. Thank you very much.